A very common reason for suspicion and rejection in job interviews is when a candidate signals hands-on or hands-off type of behavior to the contrary of the expectations for the role. So I thought I'd share with you 5 examples of the most common interview questions that interviewers use to screen for hands-on versus hands-off behavior in a bit to help you to adjust your answers and pitch the right style. The first example I'd like to share with you here would be on the topic of conflict resolution. How do you handle conflict inside your team? Or tell me about the time when you handle a conflict in your team. A hands-on type of role, such as a software engineer, would very much prefer to speak about a functional conflict. For example, the time when you had a conflict with your manager or a conflict with a peer. And the way you'd resolve that conflict would be to look into the data to find some insight to prove your point, which you'll eventually present to the other side in order to regain their trust. So it'll be a functional type of conflict. Now, a hands-off type of candidate would be far more likely to speak a time in terms of handling conflict in their team of a time when they mediated a conflict between others, right? Which for most roles, this qualifies as a non-functional conflict, which means it's not the most appropriate thing. Or for a director or an executive role, handling conflict in your team they would prefer speaking about the time when they influenced their team to a different outcome, right? I'm sure executives and these types of roles would know how to speak about these things, but long story short, ensure that you match the expectations in terms of hands-on versus hands-off behavior here. The second type of example, with respect to data-driven decision-making. A time when you had the data-driven decision-making process could be a sample interview question. A hands-on candidate would handle data-driven decision-making by diving deep into data to find some insight. For example, an economist would dive deep into some historical data to find some pattern, which they would use then to model that data, using some formulas and complex stuff in order to drive a specific decision or to convince someone of something, right? This would be the traditional way for a hands-on role to sell themselves on data-driven decision-making. This is when compared to a hands-off type of role, a director of operations, for instance, who would commission an external study, a highly data-driven, so to speak, external study, as a second opinion for them to consider on whether they would expand their product or service into a new market. Okay, so both of these examples use data, okay, but the way you would use data highly differs from a hands-on, the economist, versus a hands-off, the director of operations types of roles. And I'm exaggerating here, but when you're speaking about the hands-on versus hands-on PM, the differences might not be so obvious, right? The third type of example I'd like to share with you here is with respect to prioritization. Okay, so for example, a hands-on type of role, such as an account executive. Let's say for 1 quarter you experimented selling a new type of product, and midway through the quarter, due to some external factors, that those sales got stuck. Maybe some technical aspects, and it was outside the area of expertise to fix that. So you had to prioritize. Would you risk and wait for the technical team to fix that and enable your sales, or reverse your decision and reprioritize selling the old-fashioned type of product? You prioritize going back to your traditional sales approach in order to meet your quarter's goals, and 2 weeks before the end of the quarter, also the newer product got unstuck by technical, and therefore you doubled your sales, right? So this would be an example of a prioritization for an account executive who's highly hands-on, right? Now, this is in contrast with, a hands-off type of role who would set priorities and communicate across the organization without direct involvement, while setting priorities and making a prioritization process, which would signal a hands-off type of behavior. Next example, with respect to deliver results. So tell me about the time when you were 75% through a project, program, or solution, and you got stuck. What did you do to get unstuck, so to speak? A hands-on type of role would almost always talk about how 75% of that project, they dive deeper into the subject matter, into what actually was happening there, to find the bottleneck and eventually resolve it using their subject matter expertise. Not their friends, so to speak, but it's a subject matter expertise where you deliver for your own role. A hands-off type of role would speak about their ability to deliver in a context of you ensure that deadlines were met via tracking and removing some obstacles using your influence and these sort of things, right? And maybe one more example here with respect to learning and innovation. Tell me about your most recent learning. So what happens here is that most hands-on candidates would talk about the time when they prototype, when they experimented something by themselves in order to achieve some interesting outcomes, some interesting learnings, or some interesting invention, right? You owned that specific invention. This is when compared to hands-off type of roles, who would speak about the time when they defined a strategy or a roadmap for innovation inside their team, right? So notice the team context, which is more specific to a hands-off type of approach, right? So these were my examples. I hope you found them useful. Thank you very much for watching.